Good afternoon. I am Lois Oliver, and I am reading today from a book, The Color of Water. The author is James McBride. And just to give you a little background on James, his mother was the daughter of a Orthodox rabbi, and he was the 8th of 12 children, and he attended Oberlin College for his undergraduate degree and Columbia Grad School for his degree in journalism. And this book was written in 1995 and was a worldwide bestseller, something like 1,500,000 copies. He won the National Humanities Award from President Obama in 2016. And his one other skill, he's a saxophonist, and he has played in a jazz group and composes music. And he is currently a writer in residence at NYU. And I received this book for Christmas, and I had unfortunately not heard of it since then. The story, the memoir, which is what this is, was written with one chapter about him and his relationship with his family, and every other chapter is the history of his mother, which he did not learn all of until he was an adult. So I hope you enjoy. The first chapter is The Bicycle. When I was 14, my mother took up 2 new hobbies, riding a bicycle and playing a piano. The piano I didn't mind, but the bicycle drove me crazy. It was a huge old clunker, blue with white trim, big fat tires, huge fenders, and a battery-powered horn built into the middle of the frame with a button you push to make it blow. The contraption would be a collector's item now, probably worth about $5,000, but back then it was something my stepfather found on the street in Brooklyn and hauled home a few months before he died. I don't know whether it was his decision to pull out or not. He was 72 when he died, trim, strong, easygoing, seemingly infallible. And though he was my stepfather, I always thought of him as Daddy. He was a quiet, soft-spoken man who wore old-timey clothes, fedoras, button-down wool coats, suspenders, and dressed neatly at all times, regardless of how dirty his work made him. He did everything slowly and carefully, but beneath his tractor-like slowness and outward gentleness was a cross-breed of a quiet Indian and country black man, sure-footed, hard, bold, and quick. He took no guff and gave none. He married my mother, a white Jewish woman, when she had 8 mixed-race black children, me being the youngest at less than a year old. They added 4 more children to make it an even 12, and he cared for all of us as if we were his own. I got enough for a baseball team, he joked. One day he was there, the next a stroke, and he was gone. I virtually dropped out of high school after he died, failing every class. I spent the year going to movies on 42nd Street in Times Square with my friends. James is going through his revolution, my siblings snickered. Still, my sisters were concerned, my older brothers angry. I ignored them. Me and my hanging out boys were into the movies, Superfly, Shaft, and Reefer, which we smoked in as much quantity as possible. I snatched purses, I shoplifted, I even robbed a petty drug dealer once. And then in the afternoons, coming home after a day of cutting school, smoking reefer, waving razors, and riding the subway, I would see my mother pedaling her blue bicycle. She would ride in slow motion across our street, Murdoch Avenue, in the St. Albans section of Queens, the only white person in sight. As cars swerved around her and black motorists gawked at the strange middle-aged white lady riding her ancient bicycle. It was her way of grieving, though I didn't know it then. Hunter Jordan, my stepfather, was dead. Andrew McBride, my biologic father, had died while she was pregnant with me 14 years earlier. It was clear that Mommy was no longer interested in getting married again, despite the efforts of a couple of local preachers who were all Cadillacs and smiles and knew that she, and thus we, were broke. At 51, she was still slender and pretty, with curly black hair, dark eyes, a large nose, a sparkling smile, and a bow-legged walk you could see a mile off. We used to call that Mummy's mad walk, and if she was doing it in your direction, all hell was going to break loose. I'd seen her go up to some pretty tough dudes and shake her fist in their faces when she was angry, but that was before Daddy died. Now she seemed intent on playing the piano, dodging bill collectors, forcing us into college through sheer willpower, and riding her bicycle all over Queens. She refused to learn how to drive. Daddy's old car sat out front for weeks, parked at the curb, silent, clean, polished. Every day she rode her bike right past it, ignoring it. The image of her riding that bicycle typified her whole existence to me. Her oddness, her complete non-awareness of what the world thought of her, a nonchalance in the face of what I perceived to be imminent danger from blacks and whites who disliked her for being a white person in a black world. She saw none of it. She rode so slowly that if you looked at her from a distance, it seemed as if she weren't moving, the image frozen, painted against the spring sky, a middle-aged white woman on an antique bicycle with black kids zipping past her on Stingray bikes and skateboards, popping wheelies and throwing baseballs that whizzed past her head, tossing firecrackers that burst all around her. She ignored it all. She wore a flower print dress and black loafers, her head swiveling back and forth as she rode shakily past the triangle curve where I played stickball with my friends, up Lewiston Avenue, down the hill on Mayville Street, where a lovely kid named Roger got killed in a car accident, back up the hill on Murdoch, over the driveway curb and to the front of our house. She would stop, teetering shakily, catching herself just before the bike collapsed onto the sidewalk. "Phew," she said. When my siblings, camped on the stoop of our house to keep an eye on her, shook their heads. My sister Dottie would say, "I sure wish you wouldn't ride that bike, Ma," and I silently agreed, because I didn't want my friends seeing my white mother out there riding a bicycle. She was already white, that was bad enough, but to go out and ride an old bike that went out of style 100 years ago, and had grown up no less, I couldn't handle it. As a boy, I always thought my mother was strange. She never cared to socialize with our neighbors. Her past was a mystery she refused to discuss. She drank tea out of a glass. She could speak Yiddish. She had an absolute distrust of authority and an insistence on complete privacy, which seemed to make her and my family even odder. My family was huge, 12 kids, unlike any other family I'd ever seen. So many of us that at times Mommy would call us by saying, "Hey, James, Judy, Henry, Connor, Kath, whatever your name is, come here a minute." It wasn't that she forgot who we were, but there were so many of us that she had no time for silly details like names. She was the commander-in-chief of my house because my stepfather did not live with us. He lived in Brooklyn until near the end of his life, staying away from the throwing masses to come home on weekends, bearing food and tricycles and the resolve to fix whatever physical thing we had broken during the week. The nuts and bolts of raising us was left to Mommy, who acted as chief surgeon for bruises, put iodine on it. War secretary, if somebody hits you, take out your fist and crack him. Religious consultant, put God first. Chief psychologist, don't think about it, Financial advisor, what's money if your mind is empty? Matters involving race and identity she ignored. As a kid, I remember wishing I were in the TV show Father Knows Best, where the father comes home from work every day wearing a suit and tie, and there are only enough kids to fit on his lap. Instead of in my house, when we walked around with huge holes in our pants, cheap Bobo sneakers that cost $1.99, with parents who were busy and distracted, my stepfather appearing only on weekends in sleeveless t-shirt, tools in hand, and mommy bearing diapers, pins, washcloths, Q-tips, and a child on each arm with another pulling at her dress. She barely had time to wipe the behind of one child before another began screaming at the top of her lungs. Back in the Red Hook housing projects in Brooklyn, where we lived before moving to the relative bliss of Queens, Mommy put us to bed each night like slabs of meat, laying us out 3 to 4 to a bed, one with his head to the headboard, the next with his feet to the footboard, and so on. Head up, toes down, she called it, as she kissed us goodnight and laid us out in the proper position. The moment she left the room, we'd fight over who got to sleep next to the wall. I got the inside, I'd shout, and Richard, the brother above me, and thus my superior, would shake his head and say, no, David sleeps on the inside. I have the middle. You, knucklehead, have the outside. So all night, I'd inhale David's breath and eat Richie's toes, and when I couldn't stand the combination of toes and breath any longer, I'd turn over and land on the cold cement floor with a clunk. It was kill or be killed in my house, and Mommy understood that. In fact, created the system. You were left to your own devices, or so you thought, until you were at your very wit's end, at which time she would step in and rescue you. Although PS 118 was only 8 blocks away, I wasn't allowed to walk there with my siblings because kindergarten students were required to ride the bus. On the ill-fated morning, Mommy chased me all around the kitchen, trying to dress me, as my siblings laughed at my terror. The bus isn't bad, one quipped, except for the snakes. Another added, sometimes the bus never brings you home. Guffaws all around. Be quiet, Mommy said. Mommy dusted off my clothes with a whisk broom, set out 8 or 9 bowls, poured oatmeal in each one, left instructions for the oldest to feed the others, and then ran a comb through my hair. The sensation was like a tractor pulling my curls off. Come on, she said, I'll walk you to the bus stop. Surprise reward. Me and Mommy alone. It was the first time I remember ever being alone with my mother. It became the high point of my day, a memory so sweet it is burned into my mind like a tattoo. Mommy walking me to the bus stop and every afternoon picking me up, standing on the corner of New Mexico and 114th Road, clad in a brown coat, her black hair tied in a colorful scarf, watching with the rest of the parents as the yellow school bus swung around the corner and came to a stop. Gradually, as the weeks passed and the terror of going to school subsided, I began to notice something about my mother, that she looked nothing like the other kids' mothers. In fact, she looked more like my kindergarten teacher, Ms. Alexander, who was white. Peering out the window as the bus rounded the corner and their front doors flew open, I noticed that Mommy stood apart from the other mothers, rarely speaking to them. She stood behind them, waiting calmly, hands in her coat pockets, watching intently through the windows to see where I was, then smiling and waving as I yelled my greeting to her through the window. She'd quickly grasp my hand as I stepped off the bus, ignoring the stares of the black women as she whisked me away. One afternoon, as we walked home from the bus stop, I asked Mommy why she didn't look like the other mothers. Because I'm not them, she said. Who are you, I asked. I'm your mother. Then why don't you look like Rodney's mother or Pete's mother? How come you don't look like me? She sighed and shrugged. She'd obviously been down this road many times. I do look like you. I'm your mother. You ask too many questions. Educate your mind. School is important. Forget Rodney and Pete. Forget their mothers. You remember school. Forget everything else. Understand? When Rodney and Pete go one way, you go the other way. You hear me? Yes, I know what I'm talking about. Don't follow none of them around. You stick to your brothers and sisters. That's it. Don't tell nobody your business either. End of discussion. A couple of weeks later, the bus dropped me off and Mommy was not there. I panicked. Somewhere in the back of my mind was the memory of her warning me, "You're going to have to learn to walk home by yourself." But that memory blinked like a distant fog in a distant sea, and it drowned in my panic. I was lost. My house was a few blocks away, but it might as well have been 10 miles because I had no idea where I was. I stood on the corner and bit back my tears. The other parents regarded me sympathetically and asked my address, but I was afraid to tell them. In my mind, Mummy's warning drilled into all 12 of us as children from the time we could walk. Never, ever tell your business to nobody. And I shook my head no. I didn't know my address. They departed one by one until a sole figure remained, a black father who stood in front of me with his son, saying, "Don't worry, your mother is coming soon." I ignored him. He was blocking my view, the tears clouding my vision, as I tried to peer behind him, looking down the block to see if that familiar brown coat and white face would appear in the distance. It didn't. In fact, there wasn't anybody coming at all except a bunch of kids, and they didn't look like Mummy. They were a motley crew of girls and boys, ragged with wild hairdos and unkempt jackets, hooting and making noise, and only when they were almost upon me did I recognize the faces of my elder siblings and my little sister Kathy, who trailed behind them. I ran into their arms and collapsed in tears as they gathered around me, laughing. The next chapter is called the New Testament. Mummy loved God. She went to church each and every Sunday, the only white person in sight, butchering the lovely hymns with a singing voice that sounded like a cross between a cold engine trying to crank on an October morning and a whining Maytag washer. My siblings and I would muffle our laughter as Mummy dug into hymns with verve and gusto. Up and away she went, her shrill voice climbing higher and higher, reminding us of Curly and of the Three Stooges. It sounded so horrible that I often thought Reverend Owens, our minister, would get up from his seat and stop the song. He'd sit behind his pulpit in a spiritual trance, his eyes closed, clad in a long blue robe with a white scarf and billowed sleeves, as if he prepared to float away to heaven himself, until one of Mummy's clunker notes roused him. One eye would pop open with a jolt, as if someone had poured cold water down his back. He'd coolly run the eye in a circle, glancing around at the congregation of 40-odd parishioners to see where the whirring noise was coming from. When his eye landed on Mummy, he'd nod as if to say, "Oh, it's just Sister Jordan," and then he'd slip back into his spiritual trance. In the real world, Mummy was Mrs. McBride or Mrs. Jordan, depending on whether she used my father's or stepfather's name. But in Reverend Owen's church, she was Sister Jordan. Sister Jordan brought quite a few of her children today. Reverend Owens would marvel as Mummy stumbled in with 6 of us trailing her. Quite a few. We thought he was hilarious. He was our local Sunday school teacher and also the local barber who cut our hair once a month when we grew big enough to refuse Mummy's efforts in that direction. She literally put a bowl on your head and cut around it. He was a thin man who wore polyester suits and styled his hair in the old slick-back way, combed to the back in rippling waves. He could not read very well. I could read better than he could when I was only 12. He'd stand on the pulpit, handkerchief in hand, wrestling with the Bible verses like a man possessed. He'd begin with, our verse today is, flipping through the pages of his Bible, finally finding the verse, putting his finger on it, and you could hear the clock going tick-tock, tick-tock, as he struggled with the words, moving his lips slowly while the church waited on edge, and my sister Helen, the church pianist, stifled her giggles, and Mommy glared at her, shaking her fist and promising vengeance once church was over. Reverend Owen's sermon started like a tiny choo-choo train and ended up like a roaring locomotive. He'd begin in a slow drawl, then get warmed up and jerk back and forth over the subject matter like a stutterer gone wild. That Jesus came down, yes, amen, etc. Then he'd shift to a babbling amen mode. And there there we were in aisle 5, Sister Jordan in her church hat and blue dress, chuckling and smiling and occasionally waving her hands in the air like everyone else. Mommy loved church, any church, even Reverend Owen's Whosoever Baptist Church she loved, though he wasn't her favorite minister because he loved his wife, or vice versa. We never knew. Mommy was a connoisseur of ministers. She knew them the way a French wine connoisseur knows Beaujolais red from Vouvray white. Reverend Owens, despite his preaching talents, wasn't even in the top 5. The elite list included my late father, the Reverend W. Abner Brown of Metropolitan Baptist in Harlem, our family friend, Reverend Edward Belton, and a few others, all of whom were black. She considered them old-timers, men of dedication and dignity who grew up in the South and remembered what life was in the old days. They knew how to fire up a church in the old-fashioned way, without talk of politics and bad-mouthing and negativity, but with real talk of God and genuine concern for its parishioners. She did not like large churches with political preachers, nor Pentecostal churches that were too wild. I never saw Mommy get happy at Whosoever Baptist, meaning get the spirit and lose control, thank God. When people got happy, it was too much for me. They were mostly women, big mamas whom I knew and loved, but when the good Lord climbed into their bones and lifted them up, kind, gentle woman who mussed my hair and kissed me on the cheek and gave me dimes would burst out of their seats like Pittsburgh Steeler linebackers. Oh, yes, they'd cry, dancing in the aisles, slithering around with the agility of the Pink Panther, shuddering violently, purse flying one way, hat going another, while some poor, old, sober-looking deacon tried grimly to hang on to them. I never understood why God would climb into those people with such fervor until I became a grown man myself and came to understand the nature and power of God's many blessings. But as a boy, I knew God was all-powerful because of Mommy's utter deference to him, and also because she would occasionally do something I never saw her do at home or anywhere else at some point in the service, usually when the congregation was singing one of her favorite songs, like "We've Come This Far by Faith," or "What a Friend We Have in Jesus." She would bow down her head and weep. It was the only time I ever saw her cry. "Why do you cry in church?" I asked her one afternoon after service. "Because God makes me happy," she said. "Then why cry?" I'm crying because I'm happy. What's wrong with that? No, I said, but there was, because happy people didn't seem to cry like she did. Mummy's tears seemed to come from someplace else, a place far away, a place inside her that she never let any of us children visit. And even as a boy, I felt there was pain behind them. I thought it was because she wanted to be black, like everyone else in church, because maybe God liked black people better. And one afternoon on the way home, I asked her whether God was black or white. A deep sigh. Oh boy, God's not black. He's not white. He's a spirit. Does he like black or white people better? He loves all people. He's a spirit. What's a spirit? A spirit's a spirit. What color is God's spirit? It doesn't have a color, she said. God is the color of water, which is the name of the book. Water doesn't have a color. I could buy that, and as I got older, I still bought it. But my older brother Richie, who was the brother above me and the guy from whom I took all my cues, did not. When Richie was 14, he'd grown from a tittering, cackling torture of me to a handsome, slick high school kid who was an outstanding tenor sax player. He got accepted at Music and Art High School in Manhattan and had reached a point in his life where jazz was the beginning, the end, and the middle. He took to wearing a leather jacket and a pork pie hat like legendary tenor Lester Young, joined a neighborhood R&B band, and Ma had increasing difficulty to get him to go to school. The dudes in the neighborhood called him Hat and respected him. The girls loved him. He was bursting with creative talent and had ideas he acted upon independently without the approval of or the knowledge of Ma. A few blocks from our house was an 8-foot-high stone with a plaque on it that commemorated some civil historic event, and one morning on the way home, Mommy noticed that the rock had been painted the Black Liberation colors, red, black, and green. I wonder who did that, she remarked. I knew, but I couldn't say Richie had done it. It was all of my siblings, myself included, had some sort of color confusion at one time or another. But Richie dealt with his in a unique way. As a boy, he believed he was neither black nor white, but rather green, like the comic book character, the Incredible Hulk. He'd made up games about it and absorbed the character into his daily life. I'm Dr. Bruce Banner, he'd say as he saw me eating the last of the bologna and cheese. I need a piece of your sandwich. Give it to me now or I'll get angry. Give me that sandwich. Wait. And he would scream, and thereby he'd become the Hulk, and if I hadn't grabbed my sandwich by then, well, the Hulk got it. One morning, Richie raised his hand and asked Reverend Owens, "Is Jesus white?" Reverend Owens said, "No." Then how come they make him white here in this picture, Richie said. And he held up our Sunday school Bible. Reverend Owens said, Jesus is all colors. Then why is he white? This looks like a white man to me. Richie held the picture high so everyone in the class could see it. Doesn't he look white to you? Nobody said anything. Reverend Owens was stuck. He stood there, wiping his face with his handkerchief and making the same noise he made when he preached. Well, I was embarrassed. The rest of the kids stared at Richie like he was crazy. Richie, forget it, I mumbled. Nah, if they put Jesus in this picture here, and he ain't white, and he ain't black, they should make him gray. Jesus should be gray. Richie stopped going to Sunday school after that, though he never stopped believing in God. Mommy tried and tried to make him go back, but he wouldn't. Mommy took great pride in our relationship to God. Every Easter we had to perform at the New Brown Church, playing our instruments or reciting a story from the Bible. Mommy looked forward to the day. while my siblings and I dreaded it like the plague. We always waited until the morning of the event before memorizing the Bible story we would recite. I never had problems with these memory crunching sessions, but one year, my older brother Billy, whose memory would serve him well enough to take him through Yale University Medical School, marched to the front of the church wearing suit and tie, faced the congregation, starting out, "When Jesus first came to," and then blanked out completely. He stood there twitching nervously, dead in the water, while my siblings and I winced and held our breath to keep from laughing. "That's all right now," murmured my godfather, Deacon McNair. "Try it again," he said. "Okay," Billy said, swallowing. "When Jesus first came to," Jerusalem was, wait a minute. He stood there stalling, gazing at the ceiling, biting his lip, desperately trying to remember the Bible story he had memorized a half an hour before. "Just keep trying," and Mommy glared at him furious. A few more embarrassing seconds passed. Finally, Deacon McNair said, "Well, you don't have to tell us a Bible story, Billy. Just recite a verse from the Bible." "Any verse?" Billy asked. "Any verse you want," the deacon said. "Okay." Billy faced the church again, and every face was silent. "Jesus wept," he said, and took his seat. Dead silence. "Amen," said Deacon McNair. After church, we followed Mommy as she stalked out, and my godfather met her at the door. "It's all right, Ruth," he said, chuckling. "No, it's not," Ma said. When we got home, Mommy beat Billy's butt. So that's the end. I hope you will consider reading this. The whole book, every other chapter is about the mother and her conversion from a Orthodox Jewish family to Christian, really devout Christian. And all 12 of her children did go to college. And there are a number of physicians and professors, and so it's a great story and an interesting life for a man. I don't know whether we do or not, but anybody be welcome to borrow my copy. Thank you all for coming.